Nothing of what Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte did after being elected a successor to the throne of Sweden in 1810 was as beneficial to the country as the initiative he took to maintain peace. As an experienced military man, Bernadotte knew better than most the suffering that war could bring. This led to a policy that was anything but popular among many Swedes at the time, but he would later be praised all the more for it. In 1809, the whole of eastern Sweden, today's Finland, had been lost to Russia. This was the greatest military disaster in the history of the country. Many Swedes hoped that the French marshal would recapture Finland, and in 1812, when Napoleon invaded Russia, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. But Bernadotte was wiser than that. He understood that little Sweden could never defeat Tsar Alexander's Russia on the battlefield, and therefore opposed the voices calling for a war of revenge. Instead, he joined the coalition against his former emperor, Napoleon. The result was that in 1814 he also succeeded in becoming successor to the throne of Norway, with the approval of the great powers. The union of the two countries in matters of foreign policy lasted until 1905. The brief war between Sweden and Norway in 1814 was the last war fought by Sweden. Ever since then, the nation has remained outside armed conflicts. True, Swedish troops have been sent to fight or keep the peace under the auspices of the United Nations, but Sweden as a state has not been at war. This gives Sweden a world record for peace that is hard to beat. The contrast with the 17th and 18th centuries, when Swedes and their kings were very warlike, could not be greater. When Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte had become king in 1818 under the name Karl XIV Johan, he pursued a realistic policy adapted to the interests of the surrounding great powers. The main aim was to avoid conflict with Russia and Britain, Northern Europe's foremost land power and naval power respectively. If Russia and Britain happened to be on the same side, as in the case of the crisis in the Near East at the end of the 1830s, Karl XIV Johan had nothing against showing a military face outwards. In 1840, a Swedish admiral was consequently sent with a squadron to the Mediterranean to protect Swedish and Norwegian trade interests. But as soon as the governments in London and St. Petersburg became enemies, and that happened often, Karl XIV Johan made a point of being neutral. A typical example is the 1834 Swedish-Norwegian Declaration of Neutrality. Neutrality was not an end in itself. It was a smart policy for a small state. And it worked. When we look at the history of Swedish foreign policy under the House of Bernadotte, it is important to remember that it was pragmatic. Neutrality was one of several means to achieve peace and the safest possible situation for the country. Apart from that, there was no predetermined strategy. Oscar I and Karl XV were sympathetically inclined to France. Oscar II and Gustav V preferred Germany. Gustav VI Adolf preferred Britain, and so on. At any time, the kings and their governments could abandon neutrality if this was deemed suitable. Sweden was not neutral in Danish-German conflicts in Schleswig in 1848 and in 1864, and even less so in the Finnish Civil War in 1918 or the Finnish Winter War in 1939–1940, when many Swedes volunteered to fight for Finland against the Soviet Union. A typical example of the Swedish peace policy is the bloodless dissolution of the union with Norway in 1905. Another example is the struggle over Åland in the years after the First World War. Åland is a group of islands halfway between Sweden and Finland. The inhabitants speak only Swedish, but because Sweden was forced to cede Åland to Russia in 1809, the islands ended up in the independent Finland after the First World War. There was strong opinion in both Åland and Sweden that the islands should be incorporated into Sweden instead. The conflict could have led to war, but the Swedish government accepted international mediation in 1921. The result of this was that Åland remained Finnish, but with far-reaching self-government. This cautious policy had the effect that Sweden managed to stay out of both the First and the Second World War. King Gustav V and his government have sometimes been criticized for compromising too much with the German demands during the Second World War, for example permitting German troop transports on Swedish railways. But Sweden had had a weak defense for a long time and had no chance of putting up an effective resistance. The policy was adapted to what was possible. In the post-war years, when the Western Alliance NATO confronted the Soviet power bloc in the East, Sweden stuck firmly to its neutrality, at least formally. In practice, however, it continued to be pragmatic in order to reduce the risk that the country could be affected by military conflicts. It was therefore no great trauma when Sweden gave up its neutrality in 1995 by joining the European Union.